Why does non-monogamy seem to cause such a moral panic?
We need to understand what are our values.
Is monogamy as a whole a force for good in the world today?
For the last at least several hundred years, monogamy has been the norm.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us on the Evolving Love podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys. Real pleasure to be here.
We saw you last year speaking at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, which was really fantastic. And immediately after we saw you, Liam and I turned to each other and we said, gosh, we're going to have to get Tim on sometime. So it's really great to have you on the podcast. So Tim, Liam and I, we love talking about relationships and, we're in our own non-monogamous relationship. We've been non-monogamous for over 10 years. So of course, we're often having these discussions around morals and ethics and how everything is sort of being navigated in, with romantic relationships, but also just generally all of the relationships that we have in our lives. And we have also chosen to speak publicly, on the topic of this. We have this podcast. We've been in different, media appearances at different times. And that has meant that we are sometimes at the whim of some negative comments, about all of this, which is understandable. But a reoccurring comment, the theme behind some of these comments that keeps on coming up over and over again are these comments that say, you are so immoral, you are so unethical, what terrible people you are, you don't deserve to be parents, all of these things.
And I've even been told in a Facebook comment, Tim, that I look like Jesus, but without the morals.
Whoa.
Heavy stuff.
It's a burn.
Yeah, it is a burn. So Tim, I want to ask you, why does non-monogamy seem to cause such a moral panic with so many people?
Yeah, and look, that's such a good question. Morality is such a central part of our lives and the way that we think. We are moral creatures. We are judging creatures. We cannot help but to look at the world through a moral lens, and we're constantly saying, this is good, this is bad. And that good and bad is invisible to us in a way. We don't even realize we're doing it. We just encounter the world with this positive or negative valence with everything that we do. And I think it's a really interesting question to ask, so why is it that some of these things that we perceive, like the idea of a monogamous relationship is good and a non-monogamous relationship is bad? Why is that the case? And a lot of this comes down to these two different factors that I'm really interested in both of these. One is how we have evolved to think as just these social creatures that we are. I mean, the human superpower is our ability to live together in large groups, cooperate, help each other out, and generally help lift each other up. That requires us to have all of these mechanisms that we have evolved over hundreds, thousands of generations to help us to live and work together. Things like empathy and outrage, they kind of regulate this on the biological level. But then there's the cultural level, which scaffolds on top of that. And we have inherited not just the genes of our ancestors, we've inherited the cultural and the moral norms of our ancestors. So the big question for me is first of all, where did this judgment come from? And it's probably because as kids, we're enculturated to see certain things as good and bad. What those things are as good and bad, what the culture settles on as good and bad is also kind of informed by our biology in this really complex mix. But I would say that why is this a moral issue? It's because from the biological level, sex and reproduction are central to evolved creatures and their concerns. That's what a creature that wants to continue evolving has to spread its genes to the next generation. So it's a really key feature. But you can't do that without someone else. And when you've got someone else involved, you've got a relationship, you've got cooperation, you've got competition. And that's what morality is there to regulate. So we've got all these social, we've got all these cultural, and we've got all these biological factors. This makes sex and relationships a huge nexus of moral thinking. And people are going to bring their baggage to that conversation with you. And if they're slightly tactless, they're going to throw that baggage at you.
Yeah, you in your wonderful book, How We Became Human, which was released in 2021, you talk about this Aunt Susan effect. And when we think about the ways in which we relate and have these conversations, you talk so wonderfully about this concept of how to have healthy discourse and discussions around potentially difficult ethical and moral topics. So can you explain a little bit about how we can all take, maybe take some inspiration from an Aunt Susan?
Yeah, like the Aunt Susan effect. I think it might have been Robert Putnam, the American sociologist, who I took that term from. And the Aunt Susan effect is this idea that somebody who would otherwise be kind of morally judged as being bad in our lives, and this is certainly the case with like LGBT people during the 1970s, were judged as being sexual deviants or whatever it is. But the Aunt Susan effect is when we realize that there is someone in our lives whom we love and respect and admire and with whom our relationship is really rich. They happen to have this trait that is otherwise judged to be morally wrong. So we realize that our Aunt Susan is a lesbian, for example, and we're like, hang on a second, there's a dissonance here. Because I was enculturated to believe that being a lesbian was bad, or whatever that trait is was bad. But now I realize that the relationship in this person is far richer than can be diminished into this one dimension. And so we can acknowledge that our identity is multifaceted. Our identity has so many layers, and that just having one feature of our identity doesn't necessarily define us. So what happened, and this is a really interesting kind of historical and sociological picture, since the 1970s and 1980s, particularly when gay and lesbian people started coming out, they were showing the world how many people whom we love and respect and admire, our aunt, our dentist, our lawyer, whatever it is, our shopkeeper, they were also gay or lesbian. We realized that, hang on a second, all of those stereotypical caricatures that only had a one-dimensional identity in our minds, they're just bullshit, right? So that's one way that we can engage, is by having relationships, nuanced relationships with people where we take their whole person and we bring that in. Like, really interestingly, just as an aside, turns out I have a lesbian aunt. And so I understand that Aunt Susan effect, because for me, when I was growing up and hearing all this stuff about, gay and lesbian, I'm just like, it just doesn't wash. So having those relationships matters. But your other question about how do we have difficult conversations, it's a little bit of a different response. And I'll keep it brief, but because I teach a whole workshop on having difficult conversations, and it takes a whole workshop to go through it. It's hard, right? Because we identify with our beliefs and we get defensive and all this kind of stuff. The first step is being honest with ourselves about where our beliefs are coming from. Recognizing that we are informed by different cultures, that there's a diversity of views in the world, and that I am psychologically prone to projecting my views of right and wrong onto the world and seeing them as objective features of the world. Like the example I often use is when somebody says, yeah, I think Led Zeppelin's overrated. I'm like, no, you're objectively wrong, right? Led
Definitely
Zeppelin's
wrong.
Definitely wrong.
Yeah, right. Because in my mind, it's so objectively true feeling that Led Zeppelin is amazing. But we do this with all of our things, even with these subjective things. And I do believe that morality is very much a fluid thing, that we can adapt to the world, and it evolves and grows with the world. And there are different ways of living a good life, and there are different moralities that can coexist. The problem is we tend to think our own view is the only right one. So first we need to break that down, and then we need to actually engage, which means like doing something that humans are really bad at, which is listening. Listening, reflecting, validating the way people feel, and then exploring the terrain together rather than fighting a war. That would be my short answer to what's a great and a huge question.
Well, there is that concept sometimes when you talk to people about relationship ethics, is when some people are so entrenched in their ideas of what a perfect relationship is, how to have the relationship, whether that's monogamous people saying this is the only true way to have a relationship. And there is this kind of singular perception that is, how to engage in these types of relationships. And you mentioned how you were teaching, and in the book, you have a really fantastic kind of exercise that you do with your class. And I'm just going to quote it actually directly. He goes, "Here's a question I put to my class when I teach critical thinking and argumentation. is religion as a whole a force for good in the world today? And when I read that, I immediately kind of put my non-monogamous lens and, because I'm always reading these things and going, oh, how can I overlay this into, relationship ethics and context? And if we could try and reframe the question, I'd be very interested in your response and how you would kind of tackle something like this. So instead of that question about religion, could we say, is monogamy as a whole a force for good in the world today?
Oh, yeah, I love it. Yeah, nicely done. Look, because when I ask the question about religion, I'm trying to tap into our assumptions, the baggage that we bring to that. What does religion mean? I'm tapping into the kind of easy ability to kind of say, look, I have a particular stance, and so I can kind of tilt one way or the other. But as soon as you do that and you're talking to someone, you're going to realize there's so much more nuance in there. What do these things mean? So let's bring it on to monogamy. So I think the definition of monogamy is thankfully a lot easier than the definition of religion. That's a pickle, right? But so we can kind of say, okay, well, I think we can agree on what that is. But then we have to say, well, what's good? What is good for the world? Are we talking about good for individuals? Are we talking about good for families? Are we talking about good for communities? Are we talking about good for our genes? Because these may yield different answers. And so I think it would also tease out the assumptions that we make. So one of the things about monogamy is for the last at least several hundred years, at least in kind of modern Western societies, monogamy has been the norm. And as the norm, it's just been taught as if it's the only way, like you said. It often gets a narrative put on it that it's natural, it's the only natural way, and there's a kind of a fallacy that we can maybe talk about a bit later. This idea that what is natural, therefore, is good. And this gets used a lot. And I push back against that because there are some natural things that are good and there are some natural things that are bad. It's up to us to decide what is good and bad. So what it reveals is that we have kind of absorbed a narrative that says these things are natural, these things are good, these things are the only way. And that shuts down the possibility of debate. But if we wanted to get into it, let's say good, let's define good as something, well, maybe a lot of people would agree with, that something that is good is something that enables people to live a rich and fulfilling life in a way that does not hamper other people's ability to live a rich and fulfilling life. Now, I would say that both monogamy and non-monogamy could qualify as good.
Absolutely.
So if we just do the old philosophical trick, let's break down the terms, let's look at what we're talking about, and then I suppose what we get at the end is also an empirical question. What we need to go out into the world and look at a whole lot of different relationships and see, are they enabling flourishing or not? And from my understanding of the evidence, there's a lot of different relationships that can lead to flourishing, and there are a lot of relationships that can lead to misery. And it's not necessarily the structure of the relationship, it's the approach that people bring to that relationship.
Yeah, it's a very individual case-by-case situation. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me that there are, 8 billion people in the world and that we would be, that we all need to be monogamous, or, there's a better or a worse way. It just couldn't be that way, and even though I am a non-monogamous person myself, I often find myself, sharing with friends when they ask me, a similar question with this, is monogamy better? I actually find myself saying, probably with the way that the world is and how people are, probably monogamy is, people are better suited to it at the moment. Like probably for most people, monogamy could be the better thing because, of course, non-monogamy can, it can be triggering and it can bring up a lot of things. And there's sort of like a whole other wheelhouse of things that need to go into, if you are going to navigate non-monogamous relationships in an ethical and moral, way, trying to be like that. So, it's definitely not something that's for everybody. And I love, when we get into the ethics around it as well, with, being in discussion with monogamous friends or monogamous people who I know. From my perspective too, as a non-monogamous person, I sometimes look into their monogamous relationship, and different things that are happening for them would also be considered an infidelity or some form of betrayal in my own non-monogamous relationship. There can be, if it's, withholding things, or, not being fully transparent, or speaking about a partner in a disrespectful way would be a betrayal in a sense. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, but I love what you're saying there, because it is an individual thing. Because if we take this idea of the good is what enables us to flourish, we can imagine there are lots of different things that enable people to flourish in different ways. People are different. People have a different view of the good life. People have different vulnerabilities, different sensitivities. Finding something that fits them means that there could be multiple different ways to fit multiple different people. And you're also right that there are some things that just about all humans and all relationships find bad. Certain kinds of disrespect, certain kinds of deception, certain kinds of manipulation, the usage of power to control. Those things are probably going to be counterproductive to flourishing in any kind of relationship. But if we kind of set them aside, we can say there are some things that are going to be bad for just about everyone, some things are going to be good for just about everyone. There's still a lot of range. There's still a lot of range for us to find things that work. And one of the things I find interesting about conversations around non-monogamy with people who are in monogamous relationships is those who are enculturated to believe that monogamy is the only way, and they've never been given an opportunity to explore alternatives, may feel not entirely satisfied with the strictures that have been placed upon them with the monogamy norm, and being told that there is an alternative that they missed out on, an alternative that challenges these things that they thought were true and they resent, but they've suppressed that resentment. I think also seeing different approaches can make people feel defensive and threatened. And when people feel defensive and threatened, well, it's also a human tendency to kind of double down and try to justify what we're doing, because we don't want to acknowledge that we've done something wrong, that we don't want to acknowledge that that we've kind of gone down the wrong path. We want to try to defend ourselves, and that can produce a kind of a conflict, which I think is just unfortunate. It's a byproduct of the strictures and the norms, not a byproduct of the actual ethical arguments in support of each position.
One thing that we see, we host regular conversation nights. So we monthly kind of catch up with about 25 non-monogamous people, and they talk through their journey with us, and we kind of get into the weeds of ethical conversations and really kind of interrogate where people are coming to from their backgrounds and the context in which they're brought up. And one thing that we see over and over again is that we see people who are formally religious, who have this very strict sense of an ethical compass, suddenly move away from religion and then start to see how monogamy has been so wrapped up in their religious identity. And once they start questioning their religious identity and their ethical compass in relationship to religion, they start to go, well, actually, why haven't I thought about alternatives to monogamy? Why haven't I thought about non-monogamy? And one thing I'm interested in knowing for you is how do we calibrate that sense of an ethical compass? Is it a question about exposing ourselves to as many different things? Like you were saying, if you don't know about something, you just don't know about it.
Yeah, look, and that's such a big question around that centers on ethics, is what is our view of a good life? And is it the best one for us? Is it the right one that we want to adopt? And I'm not just saying it from an individualistic perspective, because morality is about how we relate to others and how we live in a society. So there's always a negotiation part of it as well. I can't just pick on a subjective level a kind of morality that says, well, I can do whatever I want, screw everyone else, right? There still needs to be an acknowledgement and a respect of how we interact with others. But what you're speaking to is a really core question. We need to understand, what are our values? What are our core values? And a value is simply something we think is good in the world. Freedom, happiness, excellence, love, friendship, family. What are these things that we think are good? And what's really interesting is every major decision that we make in our lives, where we live, where we work, who we live with, what kind of relationship we have, is informed by our values, right? It has to be informed by what we think is good and what we think is bad. But how many of us could sit down and write a list of all of our values? and then prioritize that list to put the most important ones on top and the ones underneath. How many of us could distinguish between what Aristotle calls like the instrumental values, the I like money, not because it's intrinsically good, but because it enables me to be able to do the things that I think are important. So really, money is less important than those final values, those deeper ones. The final values, I don't know, it'll be different for different people. Things like love, maybe. I value love and an intimate relationship, not because it leads to anything else. It's because that is inherently good. How many of us can tease those apart and distinguish them? So the first step is understanding ourselves. And look, as a philosopher, I've already mentioned Aristotle. As a philosopher, I'm contractually obligated to mention Socrates at least once.
There we go. This is the moment.
This is it. So Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. The key to wisdom is understanding ourselves. So that's the first step, understanding ourselves. And then bring it to a more modern philosopher, I'll talk about my own view on this, is that once we understand our core values, and we can be critical about them as well. You can say, hang on a sec, geez, I clearly have been making a lot of decisions focused on, say, I don't know, money. And maybe I want to devalue that compared to other things. Or I'm chasing status. Maybe I want to devalue that in terms of intimacy or whatever that is, right? We can be critical. Then we need to look at the kind of world we live in. And this is a key feature of my book, where I talk about the world that hunter-gatherers lived in, the world that agricultural societies lived in, the world that modern post-industrial societies live in, are just different. The kind of the resources, the pressures, the metrics of success, the opportunities, these are different. So we look at the world that we live in, and then we try to think, okay, what kinds of moral rules and guidelines and norms are going to allow us to flourish in this world? And they might be really different. The kinds of norms that allow people to flourish in a small-scale nomadic hunter-gatherer world may be really different from the norms that allow us to survive and flourish in this world. And that counts for things like, justice and outrage. It also counts for things like relationships as well. Now, I've given a pretty philosophical wishy-washy answer there, because the right answer to any philosophical question is it depends. So I'm hedging a bit, but that's because I don't have a single answer, because I don't think there is a single answer. It is something that we need to explore within ourselves and with each other in order to figure out the best way to live.
I mean, exploring that sense of within ourselves, the best way to live. When I was reading your book, I was definitely struck by how logical it all felt. And often when I'm reading philosophical texts or, social commentaries and different things, everything does kind of make sense. And when you often lay out the idea of non-monogamous relationships, so many people go, well, I guess that kind of makes sense. Are we going to have sex with one person for the rest of our life? There's all these different things. But what it doesn't really, when you lay it out in the theoretical manner, what it doesn't really allow you to tease out is how it feels within your body, and like an embodied response to an ethical conundrum. So when you're thinking about a philosophical approach or a philosophical framework between what is good and what is bad, you might theoretically potentially go, I know this to be good, but my body is really giving me a reaction that is kind of counterintuitive to that. How do you grapple with the theory versus the embodied?
Yeah, look, I love that question. That's a challenge for me because I'm all cognitive, man. I'm all theory. Like, I'm an overthinker. I get paid to overthink. That's my job as a philosopher, right? But you're right, because embodiment and emotion are central to our relationship to the world. And there can be disconnect between them, and there can be disconnect between them for a few different reasons. So let's say, for example, somebody has been enculturated to believe that promiscuity in general is not just bad, but what often happens during enculturation is the things that are bad get associated with emotions like disgust. And people can kind of feel a kind of revulsion around it. And this actually gets weaponized a lot of the time when people want to show, we don't like what they're doing. They try to bring these emotions of disgust, outrage, contempt into it. So someone who's been enculturated with those views, who then takes a kind of a natural and a normal response of attraction to multiple people, for example, they may have already internalized the disgust, and they then have a conflict. They say, hang on a second, I think I can justify what I'm doing here. I think I can justify a non-monogamous relationship, for example, in this situation. I think that would be healthy and fulfilling. I think everyone's on board with that. There's consent, there's respect, everything is right there. But I've got this emotional baggage and I've got a disconnect between it. So we need to, again, introspect and try to tease these things apart and see how they inform us. But it could also be the other way around. You might have someone who says, hey, I understand the logic of non-monogamy, and I think that is appropriate for the kinds of relationships that we could have in the world today. But I'm vulnerable. I'm a little uncertain about how that might work for me. I'm not sure that I'm ready to spread my emotional energy around. And they need to reconcile the dissonance between the logic there and their own emotions. It's always going to be a dialogue, I suppose, between the mind and the heart. I don't have any strong tips on how to do that because I'm still trying to figure out how to do that myself. You know?
Yeah, people ask us about that, different friends and people at the conversation nights. I remember one person was saying, he was like, I'm monogamous, but I don't believe in monogamy. Like on an intellectual, on a philosophical level, non-monogamy makes complete sense to me. It's absolutely what I believe in. This monogamy thing doesn't make sense, but I just cannot do it. Like each time I've attempted, I've tried, I'm just totally triggered. I feel unwell. Like, does this mean it's for me or against me? And, I just say, I'm not sure. You're going to have to speak to a therapist. We're not psychologists or coaches or anything. We just love, having these conversations. But it is something that comes up for people, over and over again, I'm sure.
Well, one of the things that frustrates me is that a lot of the norms that we learn about sex and relationships, we learn when we're children. We learn, we model our parents in terms of the relationships that they have. And so we inherit the norms. So you inherit a lot from your parents. You inherit a bunch of genes. You also inherit their culture and their behavior, the norms and strictures that they place around their lives. But we also inherit the environment that they create for us to grow up in, whether it's a rich environment or a less rich environment. So we start modeling these things at a really young age before we're able to really understand what sex and intimacy are. But then even when we get to the point where, young kids go through puberty, they start exploring and understanding these different feelings, emotions, the biological side, they start getting into relationships. And in a lot of places in the world, we still don't teach them at that point what the options are. We wait until they're adults when that window of plasticity, that window of malleability of them being able to be open and explore different ideas and concepts is closing. And by the time they get to adulthood, they've already kind of brought that baggage from their enculturation with them. And then they might just be beginning to explore different conceptual options, but the damage in a way has already been done. They're already feeling shame, for example, for having feelings, even though they can cognitively justify, that are going against what they learned when they were 6 years old, because they never had a chance to look at alternatives when they were young. I don't know how to solve that except through, I'm a big proponent for sex education, really good, solid, comprehensive, no holds barred, proper sex education where we're just honest about it. We're not all kind of wishy-washy and cagey about it, and making that open and honest from as young as is appropriate, so that people have an opportunity to grow and evolve around one of the most central features of our lives.
Yeah. As parents, our son he's 6 years old, and we're very sort of conscious about, he's learning about the world in different relationships, and, he has a gay auntie and he knows about that. It's just not a big deal to him. It's so normalized. He wouldn't know that there would even be an issue with that. And people have asked us, how are you going to sort of navigate this? He's going to find out one day that you're non-monogamous, and when you're going to tell him, and how is this going to come out at some point? And Liam and I really just keep on coming back to, when we will speak with him about this, it's almost like that Aunt Susan. It's like he knows who we are as people. He knows that we're kind people, that we're a very close, connected and loving couple. We're very together, but also, that we have carved a way that works for us. in a way that it's like honoring these sort of, these values of being respectful to each other, being kind, being trustworthy, having all of that as something to sort of hopefully aspire towards when you're going into a relationship, whether it's monogamous or not. And then, dependent, exactly as you said, it doesn't so much matter about the structure. But for me, when I think about these sort of, if we can have, blanket morals on things, I really feel like honesty and communication and, having good intentions for your partner is that blanket, no matter the structure. So we're not at that point with him yet in the conversations, but it is something that we're starting to discuss.
Well, that sounds really wise. That sounds like a really wise approach. I love it.
Well, you mentioned this idea of window of plasticity, which kind of really sparks my interest, because often we are also asked, like, when are we going to have like the really explicit conversations? Like, when does our son need to have the conversation with us about how we are non-monogamous? And as Abby was saying, for us, it's like a gentle, age-appropriate kind of discussion. But in your experience, when does this window of plasticity kind of open and close? Like, when are the, from a kind of an ethical or philosophical standpoint, when should we be having these kind of slightly more in-depth ethical discussions around relationship structures? Is it a gradual thing, or is it something that should be a very kind of pointed discussion where it's the big sit down, just so you know, like intuitively, I think we don't feel like that kind of big sit down thing is a good approach. But I'm interested in if there's any kind of research or experience, anecdotal experience about this idea of the window of plasticity for children and concepts.
Yes, it's a great question. Now, I can answer that from a kind of a philosophical perspective and from from my experience. But I think there's probably a lot of empirical research around when children are open and exploring particular new ideas and things. So I can't speak to that as an expert. But I do think, so the window of plasticity, what I mean by that is that we're not set in stone as kids. We know that, right? We know that there's a lot of ability for us to learn and grow and change. We do have biological and psychological predispositions. So our kind of personality is kind of largely biased in one way or another. If you're naturally an introvert, you're likely to remain an introvert for the rest of your life. But you may become more or less introverted based upon experience, but you're unlikely to become a full tilt extrovert at some point. So there are some bounds to that plasticity, but there's a huge amount of flexibility in our nature. But what we do know is a couple of things, is that young children up to about the age of 6, 7, 8 years old are just sponges. And they're sponges not just for kind of the explicit information that they are given by the world, but all of the little subtle cues about people's behavior. They are so careful at looking at where people are, where their parents' gaze is going. They're looking at how their tone of voice changes in different relationships. And kids pick up a lot from that. If a parent, for example, has an unconscious bias against people who look or sound a bit different from them, as just about everybody does, the children will start to notice, oh, you're treating people of this ethnicity a bit different to the way you treat people who look and sound like us. They will absorb that from the age of like 5 or 6 years old. So there's a lot of information that they're absorbing, and a lot of that absorption is unconscious. It's shaping the way that they think, here's how I should behave. This is what norms are. This is what's normal behavior. Here's how I should be, and here's how I shouldn't be. And all of this is going on from a very young age. Now, we can shape that through modeling behavior that we think is important, and we can also sit down and get explicit about things and bring it to the surface and say, what do you think about this? Was that good or bad? Why wasn't that the case? I had the privilege, when I lived in Sydney, of teaching primary ethics, which is a program that we run from the Ethics Centre, which teaches ethics to primary school children. And we go in during like a non-scripture period, and we offer that as a module. And what we do is we sit down and we just pose like a dilemma to kids, should this person share this thing or not if they found it, or should they, and they furrow their brows, and then we give them some, well, here's some ways to think about it. We don't tell them what the answer is. It's not the point. We give them opportunities to explore these questions, and they can lean into it, and they can use the tools. So we know that kids, even year 2 was the youngest group that I had. Year 2 kids are able to take these principles and say, well, no, okay, from this example, I think freedom is more important, and they can move it to another example. They're really, really sophisticated. But when it comes to your last question about should this be like a really big conversation or should this be like a softer thing, the other thing that kids, in fact, all humans are really sensitive to, is a sense of scale and stakes in the conversation. And if you kind of sit down with someone, okay, this is going to be really important, or you got to listen to this, and or if you're feeling a bit awkward or something like that, they're going to pick up on all of that. And they're going to feel like, hang on, something is weird here. Whereas if you kind of normalize the kind of conversation, you say, if you've got a question about anything, we talk about it, and it's matter of fact, and it's no big deal, and you don't have to feel bad about it, and we're all comfortable about this, and that you shouldn't be talking about this in public, but with us, of course, you can talk about it. And if you lower the stakes, a good friend of mine, an anthropologist, has this lovely line. He says, if you want to raise the stakes, lower the stakes. If you want to talk about something really big, make it easier, make it feel less threatening, make people feel less insecure about these things. So from that, what I would take is to synthesize these two ideas together from basically birth, have any conversation in a low stakes way, a matter of fact way, and answer any questions openly and honestly without making someone feel uncomfortable in the asking and not feeling uncomfortable in the hearing of the answer. And that can just be a perpetual norm that you have of openness and transparency and nurturing. And I think whatever the kinds of conversations that come out of that are probably going to be more easy to have than if they are held back, and then made in a really punctuated way.
Brilliant. I mean, that is absolutely fantastic advice, and we'll continue to follow it. And I hope everyone listening does follow it too. One thing that we notice is that when people are kind of judging us, they have two sets of kind of ethical frameworks for how they judge our relationship. And it really did change quite drastically. And the big inflection point for that change in the ethical framework of how people were to judge our non-monogamous relationship was actually when we became parents. And I'm interested in your thoughts around why do you think that the ethical kind of response and this sense of heightened emotions suddenly became introduced as soon as we had, children in the mix?
Yeah, that's really interesting. A couple of things spring to mind. One is just simply when you're in a relationship with one other person, there's only one other person involved. You add another person in, there's only 3 people involved, or however many it is. If you're all adults and you're all able to sit down and you're able to create and negotiate the relationship and make it work, that kind of works really well. As soon as you have kids, there's another person involved. And that person is not yet able to enter into that negotiation. They're not yet able to enter into a situation where they can set their bounds. And parents, this is why it's often talked about, parents have a responsibility. They have a duty to care and nurture for an individual, a fully fledged human being who is not yet, in a way, a fully fledged moral agent because they're not able to engage in moral discourse. So we have greater responsibilities to care for someone in that kind of a situation. So I think for a lot of people, the sensitivity is high. The feeling like the stakes are high. The feeling is like, okay, you've now got this really big responsibility. Then I think if you bring that baggage of our culture of monogamy from the past to say that the only way to raise a kid is in this particular way, they're like, okay, look, it was all fine when there were no kids involved. You guys go do whatever you want to do, shag whoever you want to shag, but if there are kids involved, I can see why people might respond that way if they mistakenly believe that the only way to fulfill our duty as parents is in a monogamous relationship. So it requires another conversation about what is it that leads to healthy, happy, fulfilled children. And that is an open question. Is it monogamy? Is it non-monogamy? Is it a bit of both? Is it anything? What are the ingredients for a rich and happy child. And that's a different kind of conversation. And you want to get past the baggage and get to that conversation, which, as I'm sure you know, is not necessarily always an easy conversation to have.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes, down to wanting to protect the family unit, but also wanting to make sure that, the home is a safe and secure place. And, non-monogamy, when people don't have much of an understanding of it and they're sort of projecting out onto it, they're thinking, well, if that was me, I would be jealous, or I would be smashing plates and screaming, and then that would be an unstable home for a child and all of that. And I think that was part of the reason why Liam and I have wanted to share about being non-monogamous, because that's not our experience with non-monogamy, that idea. But it comes from a place of, Liam and I we really love our family unit. We're a very tight-knit family, and we don't see non-monogamy as a threat to our connection with each other. In fact, it almost, for me, I feel like it's sort of, monogamy would be like too sort of fragile a framework for the longevity of our relationship, especially when we're thinking about commitment. Like, it brings me back to this thought of I'm really deeply committed to Liam and our life. I'm not committed to monogamy. I'm committed to carving something that works really well for us, that in the long term has that security for our family unit. And as much as we say monogamy and, it's just the two people, we know the stories. It's often not. There's a lot of things that can come up for different people, but it is very interesting that sort of that non-monogamy can be this challenge of a commitment to a person. But
Look, I really love the way you said that you have a commitment to Liam, but not a commitment to monogamy, which is a challenge to make us think about, what does commitment mean? That commitment is not necessarily tied up in a particular kind of relationship. You can be committed to multiple people in and not committed to a particular kind of constraining relationship. And I think that's a really interesting provocation for those who assume those two things are tied together. And it's a wonderful way to kind of open the perspective. Look, one other thing I just want to add as well is the norms around monogamy are not just by happenstance. They emerged in a different kind of cultural world. They emerged, as I've written in my book, during the times of agriculture, when suddenly large populations got together, resources were concentrated, which meant that some people could monopolize those resources, and they tended to be men because they had the physical power to protect and defend and attack others and capture resources. And so over the course of generations, those men started to, not through smoky backroom deals, but they started to accumulate more power and then tilt the rules of their society in their favor. And it wasn't all men who did that. The rules were tilted to benefit the high status men. Because if you think about a polygamous society, for example, what that typically means is that a small number of high status men have multiple partners. And if there's a 50-50 sex ratio, then there's going to be a lot of lower status men who have no partners. And that can create a lot of conflict. In the early days of agriculture, where the small number of high status men were able to really control society, I mean, they did all these dirty tricks. Like they used to, one of the reasons colonialism happened is because high status men would send low status unmarried men out into the world to fight wars. That got rid of them. That took care of that kind of problem. Of course, that has other moral problems that we eventually became around to, and we said, well, that's not really appropriate anymore. So monogamy became a bit of a bargain between high status men and low status men to say, all right. We will have a norm that says you can only have one partner, which means there should, with a 50-50 ratio, we should allow everybody an opportunity to find a partner. But of course, the high status men didn't play fair. Like the high status men were still, behind closed doors, getting up to all sorts of things. And I have a couple of examples in my book, and I'm sure we can all bring to memory examples of like very conservative politicians or conservative religious leaders who have revealed that they're having all these shenanigans going on because they are the high status men. They're the ones who they're grabbing as many partners as they can. Or you can even do like the other version of polygamy, which is just serial monogamy, where a high status man takes a young wife, has a couple of children, divorces, takes another young wife, couple of children, divorces, and just continues that process. It's effectively a form of, monogamous sanctioned polygamy, right?
Yeah.
So there's a whole lot of hypocrisy in all of this kind of stuff as well. And then these norms that weren't benefiting women, they weren't benefiting the majority of men, and yet we're told that this is natural and normal and the only way things can be. And this is detached from some of the healthier aspects of monogamy as well. It wasn't about that. It was about enforcing these kinds of power structures. It's all a little bit bullshit when you look into it, and it's worthy of critique. But this is the baggage that we carry to these conversations, where we are now told that the only way to have a healthy family is in a monogamous relationship, and family is such a big word that gets used by a lot of these conservative religious organizations, focus on the family and all that kind of stuff, as if the family could only mean this particular thing that only emerged like a few hundred years ago. It's not even a fraction of the long history of our species. And I think these are the things that when you bring them to the surface and you look at them in the cold light of day, you say, hang on a second, maybe there's some baggage that I can discard here.
I think the hypocrisy is what really drives us wild from our standpoint, because we feel so much ethical judgment often from different people in monogamous relationships. And when we look through the comments section, when we did the project, there were thousands of comments, and they were all from people who just had no sense of our own sense of ethics. They just assumed, where our ethics lie. And when we start to see, these different things, like you're saying, the politicians, we're in Canberra, so, we're surrounded by politicians. But when you start to kind of see these double standards, I think that is what is really infuriating, is because from the outside, of course, you can lay your own ethical lens onto someone's experience. And until you actually talk to them, you don't really know where their ethics lie. And so you have to assume there's got to be some goodwill in every interaction. I guess going back to the Aunt Susan, it's like, can we assume that people are operating ethically, unless they're, even with all these other factors, whether that's monogamy or whether that's religion or, whatever these other kind of factors might be.
Well, this is a huge problem, is because when there is a practice or a norm that is rare, and if you don't know anybody, or a trait that is rare, and you don't know anybody who is like that or has that trait or follows that norm, all you have is the stereotype. And this is what happened with gay and lesbian people, particularly in like the mid-20th century. There was just this stereotype that they were wild and promiscuous, and they were, hedonistic, and all these things that conservative morality didn't like. And this is where the Aunt Susan effect showed that actually, there's a lot of different ways of being gay, and a lot of different ways of being a lesbian, and there's a lot of different ways of being monogamous and polygamous and trans, and all these different ways of being. It's just one feature of our identity, but we stereotype. So talking about, some things that are natural are not always good. We are naturally stereotyping beings. We just project our crap onto the world. We are naturally hypocritical beings, right? We will, like the American psychologist Jonathan Haidt talks about how when we argue to justify our moral positions, it's really, we have like this internal defense lawyer in there. And it's like, whatever we feel, we feel disgusted by something. And the defense lawyer is like, right, I'm going to come up with an argument to support that. And we just throw this crap out there. And there's all these post hoc rationalizations. These are all natural tendencies. And this is, my whole book is about how we evolve these natural tendencies, how some of them are useful or were useful in different times in history, but how a lot of them are really toxic now, and how we need to push back against this kind of stuff. We need to be mindful of the fact that we don't know much about other people, and we can easily stereotype. So just check ourselves and maybe hold off on the stereotyping for a while. And that takes work, but that will then enable a conversation with people like the both of you, which can give a much richer appreciation of your complexity, your moral values around respect and intimacy and commitment, and give you a better understanding of what it means to be non-monogamous.
Yeah, we were talking off air about Megan Phelps Roper and how we saw her at the incredible Festival of Dangerous Ideas, which the Ethics Center run, and it's a wonderful festival. And before you mentioned this idea of the window of plasticity, okay, and I want to bring it back to that just for a moment, because I was really struck when I saw Megan speak, because obviously she was in the Westboro Baptist Church. She had this very kind of tight ethical framework that she was operating, this hyper-religious framework. But then she kind of decided to move away from that ethical framework, and then kind of ended up, quite late in life, in her mid-30s, I think, kind of moving away from that. Is there a point at which we are kind of beyond it's kind of the point of no return? Like, and particularly when we think about relationship structures, like, is there kind of this bell curve that, once you reach a certain age, it starts to, your ability to be plastic and to kind of mold and change your approaches to relationship structures?
To get a new lawyer on the shoulder.
Yeah, we need a new lawyer. Is it going to be the same lawyer once we hit 40 or?
Yeah, look, I think Megan Phelps Roper is exceptional.
Yeah.
Because she was very deep in a particular moral worldview. And she was, in fact, the spokesperson for that moral worldview. So she was the lawyer for that worldview. Her job was to defend it and to promote it. For her to have a change of heart, and I've read her memoir, and it's fascinating to hear how it happened. It was partly cognitive with people giving her arguments to challenge her views, and partly emotional, people showing that there are some who she vilified who actually were deserving of respect. And there were these two avenues that caused her to have a change of heart. But for her to radically change her views so quickly and then become such an eloquent spokesperson for engagement and openness and tolerance and forgiveness, there's a reason why she appears at places like the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, because she is remarkable. But just because she is exceptional, I don't believe that the window of plasticity ever closes. It just shrinks. It just, I sometimes call it, the other metaphor I use is that we are like soft clay. We can be molded and shaped to some degree, but we never fully set. We just get slightly harder and more baked as we get older. But there is always an opportunity for change. That change as we get older takes a little more work. It can take a long time. A lot of the change is not just in cognitive stuff and our beliefs. A lot of the change is in our emotions, our unconscious, our habits. And that is what takes weeks, months, sometimes years for us to be able to really shift, to really see and experience the world differently. I am a believer that we are always open to change, but it always takes work.
Wow. Well, Tim, what an amazing conversation this has been. I'm just going to be thinking about this all afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing so beautifully and eloquently. And honestly, I wish that we had another 3 hours to chat with you, because I feel like we're just warming up.
It's such a pleasure to be with you both. It really is.